The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
I thank the chairman for bringing this legislation to the committee. Also thank the ranking member and the chairman and ranking member of the crime subcommittee for the hearings on this matter. Cheryl, who lives in Houston now, grew up in an abusive home, sexually and physically, was abused by her father. So at the age of 12, to get away, she ran away. She began hitchhiking with truck drivers and anyone who would take her away from the scourge of her domestic terror. So she got a ride with a motorcyclist who turned out to be involved in human trafficking. He took her to a biker club filled with men who took advantage of her. He was her sex master, her sex trafficker. She was forced to dance at a strip club by day, and on nights she was sold numerous times each night. Remember, Mr. Chairman, she was 12. She was trapped in the world of human trafficking. Cheryl didn't know how to get help, and she had no one to call, no one to help provide her, or no one to rescue her. Ironically, it was a patron at one of the strip clubs figured out that she was a minor and helped her escape from this tragedy. On a long road to recovery and restoration, Cheryl now is a survivor, and she helps other trafficked victims. Recently, it was reported that in New York City, that the traffickers, the sex masters, brand the people, the young women that they sell on the streets. Mr. Chairman, in Texas, we brand cattle. Branding is for letting people know that this is property. And now sex victims, sex trafficked victims are being branded. It's also reported that one such individual, a barcode was placed on her so that the sex trader would know specifically who she was. This is what's taking place. And has been pointed out by both sides already, we need to deal with this immediately. It's not a crime that just happens in other places. We have this scourge of modern-day slavery right here in our own country. In the world of criminal conduct, drugs is the #1 source of criminal revenue. But not far behind is the sex trafficking business. The reason it's increasing is because the risk of apprehension and prosecution is less, and victims can be sold more than once, unlike drugs. In the crime of human trafficking, there are 3 people that we need to be concerned with: the seller, the trafficker, the buyer, and the victim. This legislation does that. First, we treat the victims as victims. These are not child prostitutes. They are crime victims. There is no such thing in our legal system, really, as a child prostitute. That denotes the idea of prostitution, that there is consent involved. Children legally cannot consent to sex. They are not child prostitutes. They are victims of criminal conduct, and we need to treat them that way. This bill recognizes that philosophical and social change, that victims are treated as victims, and therefore it provides for more services and shelters for them. It also gives resources to law enforcement, child welfare, health care officials, and others who will come in contact with these victims, and it provides them training so that they can be rescued. The person that we need to also go after is the seller, the sex slave trafficker. They must be put away. That's why we build these prisons and jails, to put these modern-day slave holders in jail. The bill enhances the resources available to law enforcement to make sure these traders get the punishment they deserve. But the buyer, the consumer, the person in the middle, is what the law really addresses in this legislation the most. It goes directly after the demand. In order to eliminate demand, we must target and penalize the buyer. These people are child abusers. They are not Johns. They are rapists. They abuse children and should be treated that way. The days of boys being boys in this type of activity are going to end in the United States. We'll only reduce the demand by punishing these pedophiles and the crimes that they engage in. This legislation also strengthens and clarifies the Trafficking of Victims Protection Act by making it clear for judges and juries and law enforcement that criminals who purchase sex acts from trafficking victims can be and should be arrested. The 8th Circuit got it right when they determined that the Trafficking Victims Act applies to buyers, and this law applies to that ruling by the courts. And we're also clarifying Congress's original intent for buyers to be included under federal law so that prosecutors can go after them and stop the demand, because that is what drives this type of conduct. We can no longer stand by while young girls are being bought and sold on the streets of the United States. We must make it clear in this legislation that children in America are no longer for sale. I thank the chairman, and I thank the original co-sponsors on this bill, Carolyn Maloney from New York, and I will yield back to the chair. Thank you.